Please join me in prayer. God, we have come here today to worship you. And we've come to hear from you through your word and wisdom. Speak to us today. Open our hearts and minds to hear you and free our wills to follow you. Open my mouth to speak your word for your service and praise. Amen. So, Anne-Marie and I have an announcement to make today. No, not that one. You might say we're pregnant, with ideas, that is. But please, no, not pregnant. And also, that's basically impossible at this time. And we planned some special projects for our retirement, but I want to look at just a little bit and then think about Abram and Sarai's, and of course God's project for Abram and Sarai's retirement. How many of you who are looking towards retirement are planning an addition to the family? Not got a few is sitting up. Most of us are more familiar with Sarai laughing, right? She's kind of off on the side while Abram's caring for these people. But in chapter 17, it's Abram who laughs, and then God changes his name to Abraham. So we have the story of Abram in the next chapter, in chapter 18, inviting some men. They appear close to the camp, and he invites them in, as was common in those days, to eat. And when they say yes, he then goes and slaughters the calf and sets Sarai to getting that ready and also to baking some bread. After she's done all that hard work for these men who may not only be men, they might be angels, and then at some point or other, it's the Lord speaking. So it's a bit of an interesting kind of a mix going on here. But anyways, so there's a roasted calf, fresh bread. Abram serves these to the men along with some curds and some milk. And as they ate, it says he stood by, and the men announced that Sarah was going to have a child within a year. And Sarah laughed. And one of the men, actually the Lord, it says, and that's all in capital letters, which means it's God's name in the Hebrew, Yahweh, said to Abraham, "Because Sarah laughed, you shall call the child Isaac," which means laughter. So we have these two stories in chapter 17 and chapter 18. So the Dazed and Confused Bible study is going to go, oh, where's Dave going now? But so when the editors and writers of the Bible put together the story of God at work among the Jews in the 400s to 250s, someplace like that, BC, they found that there were lots of stories and documents already in existence. We know that the book of Deuteronomy actually existed several hundred years before that, in Josiah's time. What we see happening here in Genesis is that they've included the same story twice from different perspectives. The story of Isaac. A scholar that I recently read says that there's a number of places in the Bible, in the Old Testament, where this happens. In each case, the story that the man receives, when he receives the story that a child is going to be born, along with it comes the blessing of land, descendants, and a future. Whereas the woman's story often includes that she's going to have a baby, the name for the child is given, an explanation for the name is given. It's not given in chapter 17. It's only in chapter 18 where we get the explanation, and a timetable for the birth. And that often these women were barren or unable to have children. So we have these stories. We have the men's stories and the women's stories. And I can imagine the men telling each other these stories and the women telling each other their stories. And it's more interesting. So how long was labor? And those kinds of things were coming into the women's stories. Abraham and Sarah both laughed when God told them that they were going to have a retirement project, a son that they named Isaac. Laughter. When my former brother-in-law had a child when he was in his late 40s, he said, "Dave, it's a long ways down. It's a long ways down to play with a baby on the floor or to pick them up." Just having a child must have been taxing on Abraham and Sarah. He in his early hundreds and she in her early 90s. I'm looking at some of the older folks around here. Any babies on the way? No, not for us either. But Abraham and Sarah took it on. There was hope here. There was a good thing to do. They would have energy and they would have help along the way. Here was a worthy retirement project for the two of them together. And a little bit interesting here if you read in chapter 18. So Sarah laughed to herself saying, "After I've grown old and my husband is old, Shall I have pleasure? Old maybe, but still ready for pleasure with her husband. This is my last sermon here as pastor. And as you're aware, Anne-Marie and I are retiring after this. And in preparation, I've been reading about getting old, praying about it, talking with some wise friends, discussing it with Anne-Marie and our kids, and allowing my spiritual director to ask some pointed questions about how I'm seeing my future and God in it. And I've been reading a number of books. I read Learning to Grow Old by a Christian psychiatrist from Switzerland named Paul Tournier. I read a book by a Jewish rabbi, Zalman Schachter Shalomni. It's a mouthful. The book is called From Aging to Saging. And then a book called Grace and Aging by a U.S. Buddhist teacher named Kathleen Dowling Singh. At least two of them write that the transition, the journey from being an adult to being a senior is as much work and as difficult as going from being a youth to becoming an adult. Remember the journey? It was quite the journey, that path. Getting old, they write, is not for the faint of heart. Interestingly, the writers are unanimous that the preparation for retirement and the inevitable death that comes for all of us begins in our 40s. Midlife crisis comes when we realize that we're not going to achieve all of our life's goals, whether they're about us or whether we expect God or our culture to achieve by the time of our death. The crisis is about realizing that no matter how hard we work, the world will not become perfect, and we're not all going to become millionaires. That's when we begin to plan for retirement, they write. And unbeknown to us, both Anne-Marie and I began to plan around then. One of the people in the pastoral congregation relations committee at that church that I was pastoring gave me the book Messages. And in it was a chapter that was encouraging looking at life from the center out. The first goal of this chapter was to find out what do we really believe? What is at the core of our thinking and believing? What at our heart level, what makes us tick? What are our values? And there were several tests or inventories, and the one that Anne-Marie and I chose to do was a pretty simple one. We just took some quiet time, each of us separately, and looked back at the time or times in our life when we were truly happy, really down to the core, happy. And think about what made us happy in that moment or in those times. And then jot down, what was it about those times? And when we had each done that, we went for a walk together and shared with each other, each listening to the other carefully. I remember going on that walk with Anne-Marie. And both of us came up with the same list. Our values were to prioritize relationships, and then experiences, and finally, enough money to support the other two. Enough, not lots, not a huge amount, just enough so that we could be with people, that we could do things that we liked doing, things that we believed in doing. And that gave us a lot of clarity for years to come and continues to. Some examples of how that worked out. When my dad died in 2015, there was a small but for us significant bequest. So first we set aside 10%. What a joy, is 10% of the found money, and now we can give this away to all kinds of places. I think some went to Beyond Housing. Just had to throw that in. Then we paid off the mortgage. We would have been paying off the mortgage last fall otherwise, and so in 2015 instead we paid off the mortgage. And then we took our kids and their partners out to a fancy restaurant for dinners, a place that we wouldn't go regularly. Our kids had sacrificed with us in the early years of the mortgage, and they deserved to celebrate with us that it was done. So relationships and experiences. We also set aside a chunk of money, and 3 years later we rented a house in the south of France, and we invited our kids and their partners and our grandchildren to join us there. We paid everyone's airfares, most of the living expenses while we were there in France. So relationships and experiences and enough money. And that pervades our lives. And we were on a patio with some friends enjoying lunch last year, and next door was kind of a general store and selling stuff. And you know these signs, these big signs that say welcome on them, or people at Christmas time have them, Merry Christmas on the outside. There was one there that said simply gather. And our friend said, that belongs on your place. Our house has been the gathering center for years. Our son actually said, this place is party central. And we plan to continue on that, inviting friends and family and sometimes strangers to eat and to visit together. Good Friday, I found out there was somebody at church that was going to be at First Mennonite, he's going to be alone on Easter. And I said, come on over. Got a bunch of people coming over. Come on over for Easter. But figuring this stuff out happened when we were in our mid-40s. This figuring at that age means asking how much money is enough and will be enough. It means asking, do I want to work for more things, or do I want to work for more life? It means focusing on the spiritual, the relational, the meaningful. It's hard to see those kinds of things when you're in the throes of work and family, but 40 is the time to start looking at those things and to do them. Around that same time, that values evaluation, I did a spiritual practice. So Ignatius of Loyola has his spiritual exercises, and the way they're supposed to do them is you're supposed to take 45 days off of your life and go someplace and do them. How many of you could afford to take 45 days out of your life? Like, not a lot of us. I couldn't. And Ignatius of Loyola knew that as well. So at the end of the exercises, there's a series of annotations, and the 19th one has a way of doing the exercises where you spend an hour a day for 9 months doing the Ignatian exercises. And while I had been on the road of spiritual practice for a long time, those 9 months deepened my relationship with God, a deepening that has continued. And again, my focus moved to God's schedule rather than my schedule. And God thinks in aeons and millennia and centuries. I work and think in hours and days and years, even in minutes sometimes. As a child and servant of God, my life is only a moment in God's plan, the plan that God is carrying out and will bring to completion. So unbeknown to us, Anne-Marie and I were getting ready for retirement and death long ago. Now, should you have not started at 40, if you're over 40 now, it's a good time to start now thinking about these things. It's never too late. And you can take hold of the life that God has for you now and going forward. But I have to admit that recently, as the clock ticks down to the actual day of retirement, that I've been struggling. Giving up doing what I have loved for doing for over 40 years has led to some significant grief. I also realize more and more that world peace is not going to happen in my lifetime. That my grandchildren are going to suffer more from climate change than me. The gap between the haves and the have-nots in our country and the world is going to get bigger and bigger because the rich have the power to make that happen. And all this and more has been pretty depressing. But then I remember that God's plan has been moving forward over millennia and even over my lifetime. When sometimes it feels like it's 5 steps forward and 4 back, it still is moving forward. God's plan is moving forward. Of that, I'm sure. And then I remember, when I'm retiring, I'm feeling my age. It takes longer to do things than it used to. Both because I don't have as much energy as I used to, and because on a good day, I think through what I'm going to do before I do it. Because if I don't, it hurts more afterwards. Self-care, exercises, walking, praying takes time. So having more time to do what I want or need, and relationships and experiences are among those, means that not working for a living is going to give me more time. And then I noticed that when I do that, as I've worked less the last year, I have time to do stuff that I might want to do, like drumming in the band at First Mennonite, adding rhythm to music, supporting the singers, keeping time for all of us. And I can have time to write stories rather than sermons, and I write a lot of stories. And I can make more things with my hands than I have before. There's a piano on my back deck that needs taking apart because it doesn't work anymore. But there's parts of that piano that I want to turn into things for my daughter, whose piano it used to be. I have time for Anne-Marie, for family and friends and others. I have time for books and movies, especially ones that I can share with family and friends. As an extrovert, I also noticed that a lot of my relationships have been with the people whom I have pastored over the years. So I'm taking time now to arrange coffee dates, movie nights, and so on, so that my extrovert side gets cared for. Early on in COVID, I agreed with all those memes on Facebook that said, if you have extrovert friends, they need your help. I'm doing better now as the date gets closer, but I keep on doing things that are self-care. From May 22nd to the 30th, I'm going to Loyola House in Guelph for an 8-day retreat, a silent retreat, to spend time with God, to hear what God has to say, to leave room for God to care for my soul in this time of transition. So it's silence, except for an hour a day when you can speak with your spiritual director, and an hour a day of worship. Even meals are silent. I'm looking forward to listening for God's guidance and healing. And if you think it's not possible for Dave, Dave has done this before. But it's part of my preparation. It's with my spiritual director thinking about so where is God taking me in this third stage of life? Childhood, adulthood, seniorhood. Sarah and Abraham had a significant, important, and life-giving retirement project. They would not see their family control the land that God had promised them. They wouldn't see God rule over all the earth, but they would see God at work in them and through them as they faithfully raised Isaac. And they had begun to prioritize God long before then, back in Ur and then in Haran and now in Canaan. It had been a process, and they were continuing along that process. God saw their faithfulness and blessed them with laughter for their retirement. I'm going to invite you into a few minutes of contemplation. So clear your laps. Maybe open your hands in the shape of a bowl to receive whatever God has to give you. And close your eyes if you feel comfortable. And to create some silence, I'm going to just count 5 of my breaths and then make some suggestions for you. And in your imagination or memory, go to a place that is quiet and peaceful. And invite God to join you there. And in that quiet with God, remember a time when you were truly happy, deeply happy. And think with God, what made that time so good? What was it about you or the situation or the others around you? What was there about that you would like to have in your life a lot? And what does that say about what you value? And then sit with God and talk to God about those values and those priorities. And ask God to lead you forward in your life, to focus on those things, those values, those priorities, those hopes. Because God who loves you wants you to have those things. God who was and is to come, we are in your hands. Lead us through life, from youth to adulthood, from adulthood into seniorhood, and beyond. Lead us in trust and hope. We pray this in your name. Amen.